our special guest this evening, Renato, because he actually addresses the Romans passage, the first chapter of Romans, which we have already gone over. We're beginning the 5th chapter tonight. But I thought that even though we've already studied Romans 1, it might be good to gain further insight and benefit of having Renato, who is a biblical scholar and linguist, to address some of those issues. He's known for the book that he wrote, Love Lost in Translation, which addresses the questions surrounding how we translate the scriptures. So many conclusions and theological systems are based upon a translation of the text and are dependent on the translation of the text without realizing the meaning in the original. And so this creates a great deal of confusion and problems. So I think that what he has to present to us today, or this evening, will be addressing that specific issue as it relates in particular to Romans chapter 1 on those passages that people usually quote when they want to uphold their particular view of human sexuality that does not include the same gender sexuality. So at the moment, I would like to, this is the PowerPoint, which is really good. Can you all see that from where you are? And I'm going to invite our guest, Renato, to go ahead and present this material. And then, in the meantime, while he's presenting this to you, I'll have these run off, which is essentially that. So you'll have it with you for future reference. So I would like everyone here to give a warm welcome to I'll let you go ahead and give this presentation. In the meantime, I'll go up and copy it and be right back down. Because I've already heard the presentation. But I want you to get this material. It's very good and very, very useful. So Renato, it's all yours. And you can sit here. We are live streaming. You can stand. Do whatever makes you feel at home.
Probably facing the
But that's where the cameras are.
Right.
Sit in the chair there if you want to sit.
Well, I've got my presentation up here.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So feel free to sit and accommodate yourselves accordingly. Yes, hi, I'm Renato, and I'm happy to be back. This is my 3rd time in this place. It's beginning to feel like home. I know some of your names, but not all. Should I just quickly hear from you all? I may not remember all of them at the end of the evening, but I know Martha.
Gay.
Michael Smith.
Irene Bronson.
Michael.
Right.
Mary Ann.
Ned Bradley. John Dean.
Diane.
All right. Thank you very much. Yes, well, I'm the kind of person that, you know, when I really get passionate about the subject and I research and I write about it and so on, when somebody says, oh, would you like to make a presentation? How can I say no? So here I am grabbing the opportunity again. So thank you for this opportunity, and I would also like to say thank you for those of you who have heard it before. This is going to be mainly a repetition. I may vary a few details, it doesn't happen. But
It doesn't hurt. Again.
it may comfort you to know it took me probably 3 months to get this material together. So I had to repeat a lot of stuff also in the process until I finally felt I was getting it right. So, without further ado, I want to move into a particular passage in Romans 1, which is causing and has caused great difficulty in Christian circles for quite a long time. I'm giving it a provocative title, What if Paul is inclusive? Which is not exactly what we are used to hearing. But I do this because that I have discovered in my work with Paul, there's more to him than I first anticipated. So we should not firsthand leave out possibilities. So a fresh approach to Romans 1, let's go for it. I'm dividing this into 6 parts. A little introduction, then looking at the two verses that are proving particularly controversial, and then some of the interpreters of this verse in recent years who have brought in new perspectives. I call that voices crying in the desert. And then summarize and draw a few conclusions. And feel free to hold me if I'm not being clear or incoherent, or I'm not speaking English or something in the desert. Who knows? First, a little introduction. This is a reference to a book of mine published in 2013. It's now about a year and a half old. And so some of the things I'm saying here are based on that chapter, or rather is the material I'm discussing in that chapter is reflected partly in this presentation. It's a long chapter, but then it's also quite a difficult text, so it takes a little while. But there it is for anyone who wants to read more details. The book is available online in 3 formats: Kindle, paperback, and hardback. So there. Now, one reason for delving into the letter to Paul's letter to the Romans, and I'm sure you're discussing that here, is that it is the one text in the Bible that has merited more commentary on the part of theologians than any other. That came as a surprise to me when I first started working with books. I'm like, God, you've got all the literature in the world on this letter. So that in itself draws attention to its importance. Now, you'll have to excuse the font in line 2, where it says major issue, you can hardly see it, Christian tradition, it's supposed to say. This machine sometimes translates my choice of font into another font. So this is what happens, when you move between computers and systems. But anyway, it says Christian tradition. According to Christian tradition, then, Paul condemns sexual interaction between 2 persons of the same sex. That's sort of the issue before us, and that we often hear about. One theologian among many who comment on Romans is Thomas Aquinas, one of the very famous ones. He lived in the 13th century. And he has written extensively, and he talks about unnatural vice and sodomitic vice and such things, and what is against nature. And he is one of several who regard this text as one dealing with same-sex relations. So when we have such important people speaking about it, it's small wonder that we're still hearing about this today. And according to Thomas, all sexual intercourse meant for procreation is what is natural. Nature for him is what leads to the procreation of the species. What is not natural is all the other stuff that happens in the sexual world. So in that way, you might say it's a fairly simple definition. He didn't mean what we mean today when we talk about what is natural and what isn't, if you see what I mean. Natural in theology goes back to Neoplatonic philosophy, where they felt nature was precisely that, what makes life go on, and everything else is not considered part of the natural cycle. Then you might ask, well, what about the Reformation then? Everything changes, doesn't it? Well, I wouldn't say everything, but some things definitely changed. Celibacy was done away with, in particular, and they also tried to bypass tradition and go back to scripture. They talk about sola scriptura, scripture only. However, they did not realize all the many issues that had accumulated over the centuries, in the Middle Ages in particular, about sexual issues. They didn't even see there was an issue. So they brought that with them into evangelical Christianity. So much so that some evangelical circles were very proud of the name evangelical. Today, the positions they defend when it comes to same-sex relations, I would say, are beautifully picked out of the Middle Ages. Same rhetoric, even the terminology they use, it's sort of unnatural and even some of the more hardcore ones will talk about this is demonic, or diabolic. That is spoken about in medieval theology. So that all the groundwork was laid in those centuries. Now, according to Martin Luther, divine law, and he's probably thinking about Genesis here, males should mate with or join with females. So sex between males is against nature again, and he goes as far as to call it a monstrous depravity. According to Martin Luther, by the way, in this passage he believes it was invented in Rome. He had an axe to grind with Rome, so everything bad must come from there. Now, unfortunately, this has carried on until the present day, and a particularly tragic chapter occurred in Germany in the 30s when the Nazis took power, and among many other groups that were persecuted under Nazi Germany, including Jews and Gypsies and communists, they began to round up gay people, and the churches did not speak out because everybody knew that this was sanctioned by Scripture, and it was in the German penal code. Homosexuality was outlawed at that time, even before the Nazis took power, so nobody objected to this. And tens of thousands of gay people lost their lives during World War II in these camps. They were made in the camp, maybe you've seen pictures of it, like the Jews had to wear the Star of David, gay men had to wear a large pink triangle on their uniforms. Now, the textual reference that seems to justify this in the eyes of some people, you find it in Romans 1, verse 32, where the chapter finishes by saying, they know God's decree, that those who practice such things deserve to die. Even today, evangelicals use this passage in their rhetoric. You've probably all heard about what's going on in some African countries where there's a whole battle raging, and it's particularly vicious over there because there's very little resistance from the LGBT community, which is weak and doesn't have many resources, so they are against huge enemies. And one of the things you may hear from them, and I found this from a Ugandan evangelical minister who said, gay people and those who support them deserve to die. And he's referring to Romans 1. So now, this leaves us with the question, okay, is this really what Paul is saying in this text? And if it isn't, what could it be? So now I move to my part 2, and this is where we are entering the text itself. Let's look at the language Paul is using. This is a good place to start, isn't it? When you're looking at an ancient text, look at what language it was written in, the way it was written. We find this kind of manuscript, and when you look at it closer, you'll see it is certainly not English, and it's not Latin, and indeed it is Greek. And we find it in the collection of writings I call the Second Testament. It has traditionally been known as the New Testament. I refer to the Second because it comes after the First Testament, which is what other people call the Old, but after the First and Second, because there's no particular value judgment involved in that. One comes first and then the second. And this is all written in Greek, including Romans. So we have these two verses that are contentious and of particular interest to us here this evening. By the way, Miriam, do you have a Bible there? Okay, what version is it?
NIV.
NIV. Interesting. Okay. So I'm going to look at these two verses, but take one at a time, because each verse is kind of complex in its own right.
This is the King Revised Standard.
Oh, I see, okay, the NRSV, okay, excellent. We've got several versions here tonight, that's helpful. And do you have also a version there?
New Jerusalem.
Oh, that's excellent, so we have 3 different ones now.
And we have Peter's translation.
Peter's own translation.
Yeah, he
Wow.
translates his own for our Bible study.
Excellent, well, that's wonderful. The more the merrier, really. Great. So let's look. I'm trying to make a sort of literal translation here of it, okay? What I'm seeing in verse 126 is, and you can compare with your own versions if you like, because of this, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Their females exchanged the natural use for that which is unnatural, or you could translate it as against nature, beside nature, or beyond nature. All of that may be implied in the Greek word. So I wonder, is it basically the same it says in your version, or is it very different?
Basically, the same Jerusalem Bible says, from natural intercourse to unnatural practices.
Oh,
So it uses the word intercourse.
intercourse is
Why their women had turned from natural intercourse
Yeah,
to unnatural practices.
interesting. So they use slightly different words there, don't they? They talk about intercourse where the Greek says use, and they even use practices.
New Revised Standard also has natural intercourse for unnatural.
Natural intercourse for unnatural. Okay. So there's a slight different nuances are being brought in there by the translators. The Greek, if you take it as literally, is quite says use, the way you use your body. Is that also
I think it's what kind?
the natural use?
Natural use.
Yeah.
It says that God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones.
Right. Relations. Okay. So we're not too far off in any of these translations, but they're not equally. They're certainly not all very literal, we could say.
Peter's
What does Peter say?
Peter says, for this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions.
Right.
For their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural.
Right. Function and use are pretty close, aren't they? So
Yes.
I feel Peter is probably closer to the text, perhaps, than most of our other translations here. But it's interesting to compare them, as you can probably also feel, because each translator, they have their own sensibility or sensitivity they bring to the text. And we're all a product of our education and our environment and our upbringing and what have you. So we have our preferences when it comes to choosing words. I'm trying to be as literal as possible because maybe that brings us a little step closer to where Paul was. That is my hypothesis. Anyway, so at least we can still see we're talking about the same text, regardless of what version we have. So what happens here at this stage? Well, let's just look at it in more detail. What situation exactly is being described here? Well, I'm looking at several things. First of all, if you take a literary analysis of this, look at the verbs. God gave them up, and their females exchanged. So something happens here. It's all past tense. And it's so much so that if you look at the Greek, you find the aorist past tense refers to events that took place and have finished. Talking about certain events in the past. So that's one thing that I noticed, and also note under B, their females exchanged. It's not the females, their females. So something seems to indicate that these females belong to a particular group. It's their females. They were somebody's, these females. So this is, again, it happens in the past, and it's a particular group that Paul is making reference to. Again, you have different expressions. You talk about intercourse and practices and what have you. But the important thing here for me is to see again the distinction between natural and unnatural. It has several meanings. Natural often means what is usual, conventional, or what is expected of people, the natural way. Paul uses, for example, about long hair and short hair. Short hair for men and long hair for women, that's the natural way. That is what is expected in culture. And what is unnatural is the opposite. However, and we talked about this a minute ago, use and natural very often refer, when it comes to sex, refers to heterosexual vaginal intercourse because this is what it takes to ensure procreation. And this idea became hugely important from antiquity onwards. And I've already said this, what is unnatural, the unnatural use are such sexual acts that are unnecessary for reproduction. So now we come to the interpreters. So let me just sum up here that we have a group of women who belong in a certain context because it says their women, referring back to the people described before. And we know it's happened in the past tense. So Paul is referring back to certain events. Now we go to the interpreters, and we have a few rather early ones in the early church who were reading Paul in Greek. One such interpreter is quite interesting because he gives us a different perspective than most Christians do today. Clement of Alexandria feels that in Romans 1:26 we have a group of women who practiced unnatural sex, which means that they would not offer their front side to men but their back side. So that's a rather unusual take for us, but I mean it's early, it's probably one of the very earliest we have. So I'm bringing that in, that there's more to this text than many people think.
And about when was Clement?
Around 200 AD,
Okay,
roughly. Don't quote me on this. But
yeah.
Today's churches have a very different take than Clement, as we all know. We are being told by some that Paul is referring to all women who practice lesbian love. Nothing about anal sex here. There's quite a discrepancy, isn't there? So historically, we can see how over the centuries, this is an example of how a text can change meaning rather radically. This is so much the case that this is the only text in the entire Bible that can be quoted as being prohibitive of same-sex relations between women. And as you can already see, there's some problems in this text. But this is the only one in the entire Bible that allegedly speaks against intimacy between two women. I mean, we've been told so often, haven't we, that the Bible speaks against homosexuality in general. But this is the only text that would include women. And I have questions about this, but we can come back to that. So these modern interpreters, unfortunately, they ignore some of the things that the text is offering us. We've been talking about the past tense. Yes, you can probably find some of the things I'm saying in these handouts you're receiving now. They're not 100% like what I'm explaining. This is like a more updated version, but at least it will give you the gist. So modern interpreters tend to ignore the past tense, which for me is crucial. Stick to the tenses, and then you will see when this happens. And Paul is clearly referring back to things that went on long before maybe even he was born. And the second part is this: the common interpretation to which we are used and accustomed is based on a rather late Christian tradition, particularly medieval tradition. And thirdly, and I would like to highlight this point, third point, when you read the whole letter to the Romans, you see how this fades into the background, and Paul is actually addressing very strong concerns on a very different level. This is just a preamble to his real concerns that come later in the letter. So if we get stuck there and say this is what Paul is saying about same-sex relations, we kind of miss the point he's making later on. In my experience, I kept Paul at arm's length for a long time in my research because he was no friend of mine when I grew up. But having now listened to him and questions and spent time with him, it often happens that even with people today, the same may happen with an ancient author with whom you're not particularly familiar or whom you may not like. If you do take the patience and time and really listen and ask tough questions and hear what comes back, then suddenly a window or a door will, oh, thank you, I hadn't realized this before. This is the experience I've had with Paul.
Is that for us?
Kind of modern,
What?
We're okay.
All right, everything fine. Now, we've talked about one verse only, and you already seen some of the complexities surrounding it. Did you have a question?
Not a question, but a comment.
Comment.
I've got the new Oxford annotated, New Revised Standard Version.
Yeah.
And they've got a very interesting note, which I think is worthy of reading.
Let's hear it.
They say, I can find it.
126.
Yeah. Although widely read today as a reference to homosexuality, the language of unnatural intercourse was more often used in Paul's day to denote not the orientation of sexual desire, but its immoderate indulgence.
Right. Right. It's an interesting point because some of the versions use passion before, and passion is something Paul is very uncomfortable with, extremely uncomfortable. And this is definitely part of the ancient culture of his time. Philosophers, they felt passionate people, they're irrational, so beware of passions, right? The pure mind, where everything is in control, etc. This passionate approach to things is the ideal. So passion gets them very uneasy. So they're making that point there, and it's an interesting thing to bring in. And Paul indeed does make passions. We're talking about unnatural passions here. So that's part of the picture too. Thank you. Let's move to the other verse now. We've looked at this group of women, their women, right? And people, as I said, people many times forget the their. They say, they think, oh, the women. Women did this. No, it wasn't women. It was a particular group. Their women. They belong to a group of men, and they come here. So this is my suggestion, and I hope that my translation and that of friend Peter are not too far apart. In the same way, the males, leaving aside the natural use of women, were inflamed in passion for each other, committing indecency male with male, receiving in themselves the just retribution for their error. Here it doesn't say their males, it just says the males. So clearly those who are there are inferior to those who are the. You see what I mean? Because they depend on this other group. And that's very much in tune with ancient culture, where women had held an inferior social position vis-a-vis the men. Anyway, what happens here? What situation is now being described? Oh, by the way, I forgot to check with you guys. Any particular discrepancy between my translation and the ones you have on your table? Or is it close enough?
What is the last sentence there mean? Receiving in themselves a just retribution. Is that
Please.
That is pretty close to the Greek. And maybe you have what?
Peter's
Yeah, I-
translation was receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their
Yes,
error.
that's a good translation too. Exactly. But what exactly it was, that's a matter for debate. I have my own ideas about that, what that retribution means. And some people jump to conclusions far too soon. But I think that this responds to
what is your definition
of the just retribution.
Yeah.
Well, I can't say other than this is what the text says. So what I can bring in is a particular take. Please keep the question, because I think it would be interesting to see the text before I add that. But yes, I'm happy to share it. And so, was there anything in, were yours pretty close to mine, or is it very, very different?
Close.
Close. Close enough?
It is called appropriate reward for their perversion.
Ooh!
That wasn't my translation.
It wouldn't be, would it?
No.
Perversion, for me, it's not exactly the same thing as an error, is it? An error is basically a mistake. Perversion, I think, not entering a different territory.
Yeah.
So I hesitate to go there. So let us look at what situation exactly may Paul be describing here. Again, we talked about that a minute ago, the natural use, the women who left aside the natural use. Here we have the men who left, I should say, the natural use of women. We now know what that means. They mean they were indulging in activities that were not meant for procreation. And look again, they were inflamed. Past tense. Again, too many interpreters ignore this. This is past tense. Something that happened years ago. And they committed through that an error. They were on the wrong track, is basically what he said. They went in the wrong direction. That's what it means. We can then return to what exactly Paul is referring to here. But there are several suggestions, and I'll come back to that.
Past and completed.
And completed, yes.
Yeah, that's
These-
very critical in this.
These are events you can look back on and describe from a historical perspective. That's what is implied by the aorist past tense.
Yeah, it's very much more precise than the English past tense.
Yeah,
It is not only something that happened in the past, but it was completed in the past.
that's right. Exactly.
Yeah. So he does have in mind a particular
Event.
event.
So, what happens today then? Well, today is the problem in some ways. Because we, let's say our culture, our Christian culture, has not taken into account all these details, unfortunately. That's why we're having to discuss it,
Yeah.
really. I'm bringing in two English versions. You can compare them again with yours. First looking for this verse at Revised English Bible and the New Life Version. Actually, I'm quite pleased that I've chosen two different ones than the ones you've got. That brings even more diversity to the table. So, look at what the Revised English Bible says. And men too, giving up natural relations with women, burn with lust for one another. Males behave indecently with males and are paid in their own persons the fitting wage of such perversion. Here we have it again. Seems to be a popular word in some circles, because we know what's being described here, right? This is perversion. You see, there seems to be a certain mentality attaching to this verse. But most of all, and I put the verbs in red, because this is pretty serious stuff. When you take a past event and place it right here in the present before us, that changes kind of the perspective, doesn't it?
Do you have, you're from Denmark and the language of Danish. Do you have this proliferation of translations in the Danish language like we have in English? And is this a problem?
We are blessed with fewer translations because it's a smaller language area covered. But yes, they do appear, and I'm sorry to say, I've been looking at them recently, and I've even written a letter to the Bible publishers because they're making the same mistake.
Okay, so we're doing the same.
Yes, so it seems to be, overall in the Christian world, you find it in lots of places, that people are so used to being taught what this text is all about that they don't even see the difference between past tense and present tense. They're used to thinking it is about what's happening now. Of course Paul is condemning same-sex relations. Look at this. And then if you translate it accordingly and make it present tense, then it becomes obvious. And I'm saying, sorry folks, that is not exactly what he's talking about. He's not even talking about something that was happening in his own day. He's talking about something that went on well before him. So look at the burn, behave, and are. I put it in red, and I'll put a thick red line under it if I were to correct somebody's translation in the linguistics class. Because this is not good enough. I mean, you would be suspended because you missed it. You should know by this time when you're translating a Greek text the difference between past tense and present tense, right? And perversion, well, we talked about that a minute ago, that's not a very good word because the Greek word means error, plane, something that goes out of course, goes in the wrong direction. So we have major problems here in the Revised English Bible, which, by the way, in some circles was applauded when it appeared. But the more I look at it, the less I applaud it. I'm sorry to say that, because I'm not here to knock fellow translators. I mean, I've worked all my life in translation. But it goes to show when you go into controversial texts, we all bring baggage. And we've been taught what to think. So preconceived ideas appear in our text sometimes without even us realizing it.
Is this one the same as the New English Version?
The new, yes, hang on a minute. Was it the New English Bible that became the Revised English Bible?
I can't.
I know, but
There's a new one, I can't remember the exact, it's not the same, it's
Right.
one that came out very much more recently.
Yeah, that's the,
That the thumpers are really
yeah, the
fond
New
of.
English.
yeah. Or since 1914, I have looked at 40, not 14, but 40 different English versions have appeared. And every year a new one has come. And they're all saying, in the preamble, well, we felt really a huge need to produce a new translation because all the other ones are so inaccurate and they make the same mistakes, which is interesting. So there's a strong tradition that tells people what to think from these texts.
And they all say, we've gone back.
To the original languages, they all say that. They're so proud of it. And I mean, I'm sure they're doing well in other texts, but I'm looking at one particular set of texts. I'm not knocking them overall. I'm just saying when you come to this area, watch out. People bring their biases and their issues with them. So, the Revised English Bible, we can see this now, it has updated the story using the present tense and bringing it into the present. Where it says burn, behave, and are paid, right? And it has introduced a rather unsuitable word, and it was a newer version too, and which is not that uncommon, perversion, which is not exactly fitting for the era that Paul is talking about.
It's a stretch.
It is, yeah. Let's put it that way. Being a bit elastic.
Yeah.
So, but if you go to the New Life Version, They don't make the same mistake in the past tense, as you can see, or turn in past into present. They're doing it right. They say in the same way men left, so that's okay. They're staying where they should be in the past. Men left the right use of women's bodies. They did sex sins with other men. Now this is interesting. The word sin we have not seen before. So this is now being brought in by this group of translators. They're calling this sin, which is interesting. They received for themselves the punishment that was coming to them for their sin. I would call that a somewhat colloquial expression. So this is perhaps one of the many translations that are coming out today, you know, where they talk about presenting the Bible in everyday or easy to read English. They've become very popular in the past 10, 15 years, haven't they? Which is an interesting, it's a modern concept, because in ancient times there never was an easy to read Bible. So it's only now in modern times we begin to talk about that. And that raises lots of questions too. Anyway, the problem with these easy to read versions is that they usually don't put in any footnotes. So you get the impression everything's fine and dandy, all problems have been solved. This is what all you need to know, which is not exactly the case.
Well, and in this translation, they use the word sins in the Greek, harmatia.
Yeah. Which is
Paul
not
had
bad.
that word, he could have used that word,
Oh,
but he did
yes.
not use that word. So they're really giving a misleading translation of
They
false.
are. Exactly. Paul is quite familiar with the word sin and uses it elsewhere, but it's not here. So they have sort of inserted it from a very different very different context. So this again, you know, gives us an idea of, well, sin, I kind of know what that is. He might mean that. You see, it brings in ideas that don't really belong here. So it's fraught territory. Let's be clear about that. So I'm seeing that the New Life Version introduces inaccurate language, such as the word sin is being colloquial. When it says it was coming to them, I mean, I can forgive them for that. But sex sins, what is sex sins to you? Right? That leaves them up to you to define. And the error has disappeared, and we have got a sin instead. So again, that leaves us a little afloat or adrift into a different direction. So, I'm afraid that some English versions are sending a rather clear message to their readers. The Bible is clear and unambiguous with regard to homosexuality. Who has not heard this said in this room? I'd like to see hands all over. I think we would all raise our hands if somebody asked, have you ever heard that? And this is one of the texts people are referring to. So I'm now in the business of raising questions. What is so clear and unambiguous here with regard to homosexuality? I have lots of questions. So people have made it clearer and more unambiguous than it really is. People, I mean translators and commentators. It's a well-known fact that Paul and the Bible strongly condemn homosexual relationships. I mean, that's out there, isn't it? In public debate and in the media, you hear it all the time. The main guru, I know, Mark, I'm sorry about bringing up in this man here. I know he gives you nightmares. Robert Gagnon is the guru of this particular school of interpretation, which is popular in such a scholar, teaches at Pittsburgh, and has written a major book which holds a seat of honor on my shelf at home, in the sense that I often look up passages to see what he's saying. I take, in many cases, the opposite view of Robert Gagnon. But in my own book, Love Lost in Translation, I use him as my chief opponent, because he's there for me to quote, and then I can say, okay, I'm happy with this, what he's saying because, and then I go back to my own stuff. This is Robert Gagnon. He's enormous. If you ever visit his website, I mean, you'll be impressed by all the stuff he's writing about. And he's on
He's
Facebook.
so nasty.
His Facebook
He's so
page is this
nasty
long.
and ugly. It's
So-
just so unnecessary.
But there he is. So
How
he,
how do you mean nasty and ugly? What are you referring to?
Oh, he will insult anybody that has a different view.
Oh,
I
okay.
mean, he's just really terrible.
His way or the highway.
Yeah.
a few years ago, I couldn't find it when I checked the other day, a couple of years ago, he had a photo gallery. Apparently he had somebody that maybe to take it down, where his opponents, all the people he didn't like, were appearing, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, and a lot of other people were there, Desmond Tutu, all those guys who are expressing views that differ from his. And then there was a picture of them all, and there was a bit of text where he explained to his readers where these guys were going wrong. That has now been taken away. I was hoping I could find it again and refer to it, because it's quite entertaining. And I was hoping maybe one day I would be allowed to appear. I would be in very good company.
Yeah. His rogues gallery.
Yes.
Yeah, that's like an ad hominem attack.
Yeah. Yes. So anyway, so much for that. I've sent a call for reflection if you need one. We are probably reaching the halfway mark. So how are people doing? Am I being clear in what I'm saying? Am I being coherent? Am I speaking English?
Your English is good.
Oh, thank you.
His Spanish is apparently good too.
It was funny when I
couldn't believe it.
was speaking Spanish earlier today in Long Beach, and I could feel my tongue. It took a while for it to warm up. You know, to get, because your mouth has to move in other directions when you're pronouncing the words. So I got there, but it's a bit uphill at the moment, you know. That's the way it works.
Excuse me,
Yes.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, does anybody speculate or say what Paul was referring to about the men? It says menfolk in Peter. It says menfolk receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. Jerusalem Bible says getting an appropriate reward for conversion. And the other one refers to something that apparently is referring to some concrete thing that
Yeah.
everyone would have understood these men suffered.
Something.
What
So-
is it? What are you looking
That's
at?
right. That also ties in with your question from a minute ago, didn't it? So thank you for raising that again. Please hold it, because I'm coming to it. And I'd like just to prepare the way for us so we can perhaps address it more widely. But it's an important question because we're still left with that question. That error they had to pay for, what was it? And in what way did they have to pay? What was the penalty? Right? We're left with that question because Paul doesn't explain it. So there must be something there in the context to help us there. So,
But that point that he made, I think, is really good, and we see that in other places. He is assuming that the audience knows.
yeah,
It is a letter to people
in Rome.
living in that time, and he assumes that they know what he's talking about. We're the ones that don't know what he's talking about.
Thank you for that. Paul is probably responding to a letter he has received from Rome. It seems to me because he's addressing in chapter 2, he's addressing somebody in Rome and really pointing his finger at him. So Paul is probably responding to what he has received from Rome, and this is his response. So we are the handicapped ones. We're at disadvantage because we don't have that other letter. So we can see in what way they fit together. Do you see what I mean? So that is when you deal with correspondence, you only have one half. Well, it feels like, you're not really walking smoothly here, right? So this is what we're facing. So we have to guess many times, but we're getting a little help now. What do you call it? I'm now going to some contemporary, recent interpreters who are sharing some of their insights, which may help us figure out what is being talked about here. Voices crying in the desert. The first one I'll go to is somebody called Thomas Hanks, unrelated to the film actor. He always hastens to add when he introduces himself because people look surprised. But this is Tom Hanks, and he is proposing several points if we want to understand Romans 1. He said, read the whole letter. Far too many people let themselves get bogged down in Romans 1 and then they move on to something else. They don't even see the other 15 chapters. So they're taking a small piece and think they understand what Romans 1 is saying. Thomas Hanks is saying this is not quite good enough. If you really want to know what is in there, read the whole thing. And then he's also making an interesting suggestion, which I also recommend. Begin at chapter 16 and then read your way backwards until you reach chapter 1. By that time, you'll see, oh, I'm beginning to see some of his concerns. I hadn't thought of that before. And this is also one of Tom Hanks's main contributions. He is noting how Paul over and over is discussing how oppressed people can find liberating justice when they seek God. Now I want to bring in another. Thomas Hanks, by the way, is Presbyterian like Robert Gagnon. Okay, they belong to the same church, but certainly go in very different directions there. And I believe they have many discussions, those two. Now, I want to bring in a Roman Catholic theologian called James Allison, who has written some amazing books that I've enjoyed very much. And he's bringing in some more insights here. He's noting what too many commentators ignore, that Romans 1 and Romans 2 in the original are continuum. There's no division. That came in the Middle Ages. People started dividing up, because you only had a scroll. And each time when you open the scroll, it reads all as one continual document. But that became cumbersome in the Middle Ages, and so people said, okay, let's divide chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. So people stop when they get to chapter 2, which is a shame, because Paul doesn't stop there. He continues this argument into chapter 2. So James Allison said, read them together, 1 and 2. And then the second point here, James Allison points out that this what seems to be a vitriolic discourse in chapter 1 may well be a rhetorical trap that Paul is setting up to catch the judgmental Jewish reader in chapter 2. Because he's almost saying, I'm paraphrasing now, he's almost saying in chapter 2, ha, I gotcha. You can sort of see that the judgmental reader, I like this, stuff about these idolaters, all these terrible things they're up to. I gotcha. So it could be a rhetorical exercise that Paul is making here, that he's not really meaning it seriously, but he's trying to get the judgmental peoples out there and say, hang on a minute, is it for you to be judgmental? I'm afraid it isn't, and you are no better than the people you're criticizing. And then thirdly, and this is very important, lots of commentators have missed out on this one. Over and over, these passages in Romans 1 reflect, in one way or another, passages of the book of wisdom. Some people call it Wisdom of Solomon. It was written in Greek 200 years early and was famous by this time. And the book of wisdom talks about idolatry and great problems that idolatry caused. And this is the same as Romans 1. Idolatry is all over the place. Jeremy Townsley, another scholar I haven't met, I met the other two, he brings in further information. He's underlining what I'm saying. Idolatry is the main issue in Romans 1. And then also another fact. Rome had hundreds of temples when the first Christian community is formed. There's over 400 temples in that city, dedicated to different deities of the ancient world. Not just Jupiter and in Greece it would be Zeus, etc. etc. I mean, they were all there, plus many others. Because Rome at this time was a cosmopolitan city, so people had moved there from all over the place and brought their own deities. So you have all these temples in Rome. And then I find this really interesting, the third point. long before Paul's day, in the first century, before the Christian era, some well-known scandalous events took place in certain temples in Rome. So scandalous that they went down in history. Described by the historian Livius. He's referring in particular to the Bacchanalia, orgies dedicated to Bacchus, the god of wine. And there were other orgies dedicated to the goddess Cybele from Asia Minor. The Bacchanalia were so scandalous that they were prohibited by the Roman Senate. And some of the organizers were executed. People who do such things deserve to die. You see that there may be a context there. These were past events that were known before Paul's day, and they were famous, talked about in the history books.
Or infamous.
Oh yes, a better description, yeah, exactly. Then Douglas Campbell brings in yet another perspective, which has been missing. And I respect Douglas Campbell for several reasons. A, some of you saw my book the other day, which is respectable in size, right? 700 pages. Now, Douglas Campbell has produced a book that is a bit larger than mine. It's 1,100 pages. It's not the kind of book you would just stick in your pocket, right, any day. So I had to borrow it in the library. And I confess to not have read every page. But he's raising some very interesting point because he spent years researching Paul. So he has some special insights to bring. And he's launching new theories in this context. So I'm just bringing in 3 of his points that I find interesting. He's confirming what James Allison and Jeremy Townsley are saying, that Paul here, several of his phrases and words reflect the book of wisdom. You find them verbatim there. But then, what the novelty of Douglas Campbell, in my second point, is saying that these polemical points or opinions, they are actually not Paul's own personal opinions. They are the opinions he's using to trap the Jewish reader in Rome, because they are really his opinions. So Paul is quoting them initially, and then he catches them in chapter 2. Ha! Gotcha now. Which puts Paul in a different category from me. Maybe he's a sophisticated writer who manipulates his readers a little bit. He's not just going on and on about his own personal views about it. I think Douglas Campbell may have a point. At least I want to entertain that idea. So, if we accept that, at least as a possibility, we can say that Paul does not share these views expressed in Romans 1 about the idolaters. He actually rejects them in Romans 2 because he's pointing out they're flawed. You are being judgmental, you who say this. And this is not really the Christian way, to go on and on about what bad people the idolaters are. That's not really what we're supposed to do as Christians. We should be placing our emphasis elsewhere. So at least now you have an idea what this may mean. And now to try to address your concerns, let me just go back to here, and I'm drawing on James Allison and Jeremy Townsley, the Bacchanalia and Cybele. The Bacchanalia, as I said, are well described in Livius, and they went on for a while, and Rome was kind of used to scandalous stuff, right? I mean, after all, they had an emperor called Nero, and he was no discreet person in any sense of the word, right? So Romans were pretty much used to all kinds of things, but the Bacchanalia did much, even so. They got out of hand, so they were prohibited, outlawed, and the organizers were executed, okay? So that was a scandalous event. It could be that one of those that Paul is referring to, because he's clearly referring to idolatry in the chapter 1. The other, the Cybele, and this is where at least I feel that we have a rather plausible theory for explaining what was the penalty they had to pay and how does it show in their own persons, right? This is a question for us. Well, in the case of Cybele, the people who participated in those, they were orgies, certainly very orgiastic in several ways. So they would work themselves into a frenzy. they would take drinks and maybe drugs. I don't know exactly the details, but they were certainly pretty wild to the outsider who watched them. And then at one point, the men participating, who were dedicated to Cybele, they would feel the urge to castrate themselves. Once you were castrated, you became a eunuch, and then you could become a priest of Cybele. Because he required male priests who were, it took these orgies for them to get to that state of mind where they would say, all right, I'm doing it now. So it could be a reference, this error, and it could be a reference, because that shows pretty clearly people's bodies, doesn't it? Forever after. So I'm not saying it was it, but I see the most plausible of theories I've seen yet. Physically, it shows. So all of these events are there, at least in the background, and we can pick and choose as much as we like, but I think we should bring it to the table when we're discussing this text. So, if you want to study it in more detail, I mean, you probably got plenty of good material already, but here I'm adding my little egg to the basket.
This is great.
So, I am now proposing, adding to what we've just heard from the other scholars, that these events described occurred in the past, and this is not being emphasized enough. That's why I'm doing it. And somebody has to do it sooner or later. Saying, hang on guys, we are looking at past events now. Okay, and this is very clearly, as Peter and others have pointed out, according to Greek grammar, this refers to something that took place a while ago and is over and done with. I'm also suggesting that if you take all these factors into account, we may actually come to have a different view of Paul and not seeing him any longer as this raving homophobe who's out to get the gay people. Which, by the way, is an anachronism returning to this day, because in those days sexual relations took rather a different turn than they do today. So I would suggest that Paul is actually quite a sophisticated writer who uses complex rhetorical devices to catch his readers, to make his point. And he's been far more sophisticated than many of the commentators we read in the real world. We're making it really simple for us. So, and I'm also suggesting as my third point that Paul is unconcerned about what we would call same-sex erotic activity. That is not really his concern. He does care, and this shows very clearly in the final chapters of his letter to the Romans. He cares passionately about unity in that community. Because what he's seeing, and this may have shown in that other letter we can't see, that he received and he's responding to it, it seems to show that there's strong division in Rome between those who are of Jewish descent and those who come from these pagan religions, that they aren't really getting along. That may be the background for this whole debate taking place in the Romans. And he's been passionately pleading towards the end of the letter, please stay united in Christ. That is what matters to everyone.
Have you heard if there was much crossover? You go to church one day and you go to the pagan ritual.
I haven't done much research.
So
Well, who knows? There may well be. There may well have been. But maybe some Jews who felt attracted to the Christian message, they weren't quite sure, so they might have gone back and forth for a while. Why not? I mean, people are doing it today, aren't they? Those who are not quite sure about that they're in the right place, they may go shopping elsewhere, don't they? So I'm sure that has happened too, because in the Hellenistic times it was extremely diverse. And you had lots of different religions competing with each other and so on.
Well, that's been our experience here at St. Agnes. We have some people who, for a long time, will go to the Roman Catholic Church, come here, go back and forth.
Yeah.
You know.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So that's a common.
Yeah, it's a kind of part of the human experience in
Yeah.
music, isn't it? That we're looking for something, and maybe I'm not in the right place now, should I try somewhere else?
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure that has been the case there.
Or, I said go dabble in Eastern religions and then come back.
Yeah. Right, maybe a bit wiser for it. also sometimes, right? Sometimes we need to go out there and see, oh, no, this wasn't really what I needed. And then maybe find more in the religion that you hadn't thought of before. That's certainly been my experience. I wouldn't say I left Christianity for a long time, but there were years where I didn't really go to church because I felt I had more important things to do. What I really did, I needed to explore other things in life. But now I'm back with the Indians, as you can see, and I'm much happier for it. Because now I'm motivated to be there. Not just because I was taught, by my family, this is what you're supposed to do. So let me now summarize. I hope I'm not sending you to sleep.
Nobody's asleep tomorrow.
All right. So, summarizing. Christianity has defined same-sex love as unnatural acts, rebellion, sin, perversion, crime, destruction. I could add a few more, sodomy, and other ugly words that have been invented over the centuries. In fact, it has then also used Romans 1 as one of the clobber texts, as some people call them, or we might call them text of terror. This was invented by a feminist theologian, Phyllis Tribble. So I borrowed it from her. And Romans 1 then has become one of those. Romans 1, summary 3, echoes the book of wisdom, which talks about idolatry. Very much so. Summary 4. Verses 1, Romans 1, verses 26 to 27, refer to groups of people who lived and acted in Rome in the past, years ago. This text describes sexual activities associated with pagan temples. Sexual activities, I might even put orgies. That's the way I read the text. It seems to be orgiastic, slightly out of control. We've not said very out of control. The women, their women, remember, seem to have practiced anal sex with men. I'm now leaning on Clement of Alexandria because he's so early in the chain of interpreters. And the men seem to have engaged in sexual orgies that caused a political and social scandal. Summary number 6 in Romans 1. Pablo, I haven't even corrected it since I saw you last time, so embarrassed. Pablo is the Spanish word for Paul. Again, another crossover in my mind at the moment. Am I still speaking English? Indirectly, citing statements made by a fanatical Christian teacher, he's talking a lot to him in chapter 2 with a Jewish background who lives in Rome. Paul is saying to him, you who teach in this community, and he's clearly a Jewish man who goes on and on about idolatry. And the apostle then distances himself from this teacher's views, and he's rebuking him rather strongly in Romans 2. So where he's setting it up, the trap, rhetorical trap in Romans 1, he's springing it on the teacher in Romans 2. Now to conclusions. First, these two verses in Romans refer to A, idolatry, B, scandalous group activities, C, past events. Second conclusion. The rhetoric used in Romans 1, we've already seen that, echoes the book of wisdom. Third conclusion. The condemnation expressed in Romans 1 is not part of Paul's theology. It's not his own views. He's reflecting somebody else's views. Fourth conclusion. The polemic in Romans 1 and 2 is addressed to a fanatical teacher with Jewish roots who lives in Rome and apparently plays a major part in the community in Rome, and is part of the division that is occurring there. In Romans 2, Paul rebukes the Roman teacher who is wasting his time criticizing idolatry, rather than focusing on Jesus Christ. These two verses do not refer to Christians. Hello? Some people have been trying to say that for years. Christians are not mentioned here. These are people outside the Christian circle who lived even before Christianity arrived in the scene. And there is no mention of two people loving each other. You may have noticed. They are absent from this picture. I'm referring to scenes such as these. Eighth conclusion. Paul does not share the views expressed by Christian tradition. His point is different than that of many interpreters who are using Romans 1. His concerns are different. Ninth conclusion. In this letter, Paul's concern is to encourage respect between the two communities in the Roman group of Christians there, Jewish and Gentile, who are not getting along very well. So Paul here in Romans 1 does not really seek to exclude anyone. He's trying to, in the whole letter, to include both Jews and non-Jews in this Christian group that has been formed in Rome. I would like to finish with this quotation from Romans 16, the final chapter. I urge you, brothers and sisters, to keep an eye on those who cause dissensions and offenses in opposition to the teaching that you have learned. Avoid them. So, any further questions? There's a book there. You can
Well, did the people at the time, did they understand what Paul was teaching? If you go from chapter 1 through 16, did they get it after that time?
I wish we had the whole correspondence back and forth, which would be amazingly interesting, wouldn't it? A, to see what he's responding to, because he's obviously responding to what's going on in Rome, and B, see how did they then carry on the correspondence from there. But they would probably have understood his point rather well, because he's talking both to the Jews in Rome and to those who have a pagan background. So I don't know, there may be some research out there who are trying to look at that, but it probably partly based on conjecture. I don't know how much research there is. What there is true though, and you've probably seen this also, there's this much research on Paul coming out over the past 10, 15 years, that you won't believe it.
It's quite amazing. It's hard to keep up with it all. But unfortunately, we don't have any contemporary documents that would tell us about how they responded.
That's right.
Regarding your research,
Yes.
I understand that in, I don't know if it's in Jerusalem or wherever the holy papers are kept by the Jewish authority. But do you have, and have you had access to those documents?
The archives.
Yes.
I have not been there. So I base myself on the most, the best manuscript we have available now. We edited, and I look at those. So I rely on that. Yes. There may be some important discoveries, even if you were to go through all the archives. That would probably take me another few years, and I'm not sure that I'm going there yet. But a historian would probably really bring up some interesting stuff. I trust, and you may call me naive, but I trust at this stage that research is now at a decent stage with biblical manuscripts, that we probably have got a fairly good level of scholarship. We know from the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found 50 years ago or so, something like that, 40 plus years ago. Thankfully, we are able to see from those fragments that have been preserved in the biblical scroll that we can see they are pretty much like the Hebrew manuscripts we are using for our Bible translation. So not a lot has changed over those centuries, which is good news.
Yeah.
Because that really tells us the ancient rabbis, they were pretty meticulous and accurate when they copied the ancient Bibles. They would do it by hand, and they did a pretty good job because there are very few discrepancies between the Dead Sea Scrolls and those. So I'm happy from that perspective. We've got pretty decent Hebrew scriptures today. And also Greek scholarship has made rather important strides. The King James Bible was translated from Greek manuscripts available around the Renaissance. But we have better manuscripts today that have been found in different places. So I'm kind of relying on that. That's why I was.
Do you have thoughts on Constantine and the writings that were not included?
The writing not included in the Bible.
Yes.
Are
they
there's many.
someplace?
Pardon?
Are those still available?
Oh yes.
I've heard that so many were destroyed.
Oh, I'm sure that there were lots of ancient manuscripts have been destroyed. But you'll be surprised if you, for example, look at the Jewish intertestamentary literature called the Pseudepigrapha.
Yes.
There's enormous editions of those, all those writings that did not make it into the scriptures. There you have there's lots of them. You have the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Enoch. Incidentally, these two that I'm mentioning now did make it into the Coptic Bible.
Yeah.
Not in ours, but the Coptic used the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, which is an example of what you were saying. And then other books didn't. The Assumption of Moses, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. I mean, in the Hellenistic era, you won't believe there's an amazing amount, and a lot of it has been preserved. So we shouldn't just, tear our robes and say, how bad did it all disappear? It didn't all disappear. But a lot of it did, of course. But we have actually important witnesses from those days still. And the Jewish tradition has been rather well preserved, I would say. It's a very large Jewish literature that goes back to way back then. So, and a lot of it's quite entertaining. The Midrash, there are some amazing. But if you, for example, read about Sodom and Gomorrah in the Midrash, your eye will go, ooh, look at this. They had a great imagination to fill in the gaps in the story that they felt ought to have been included, maybe. Sure, so this is my take currently on Romans 1. Does any of what I say match what you're reading in your translations, or what thoughts you may have about the text, or am I way off? Are we on different planets here? You can live with it. What were you saying?
I was saying your translations were very close to the translations that we've been working on.
Oh,
We've
that's a
also
relief.
been reading Romans as though Paul had sent the letter preparing them for what his thoughts were going to be when it actually appears there. So he's laying the groundwork.
I think you're right, because he does say, even in Romans itself somewhere, I am aware that I've been using pretty strong language here. He says that. So I think that this is part of an interaction, a correspondence between them, another sign of that is going back and forth.
Now, I thought it was interesting, the Jerusalem Bible, which is a Roman Catholic Bible, doesn't quite put the events in the past, like you said. And how it does, it says by saying, the women have turned from natural intercourse, have turned.
Does it
It's
say-
very fact it's still
Yeah, it's ongoing.
And then it says, and the men folk have given up natural intercourse, have given
I
up.
have given up.
Okay, but then it goes into that thing about receiving an appropriate reward for their conversion. And that implies something that happened in the past. In other words,
That's right.
that's what struck me, is they were talking about something happened in the past. And I know that particular 27 has been quoted in a context of modern times, leading people to equate AIDS, for example, with something Paul was talking about.
Yes.
And when you step back and look at it and what he's writing, that's the perversion, to take something Paul's writing and try to plant it today. But it does strike me that you pointed out that in many translations it is something in the past. Jerusalem Bible puts it as more something that is a present thing, because they have turned. But you can't deny this language about them getting an appropriate reward for their perversion as having something that had to have occurred at the time he wrote it.
Yes.
So basically what I come down to is I'm really leaning towards your interpretation and Peter's interpretation of this because of that.
Right. I mean, whenever you want to interpret something, particularly in regard to this area of discussion and debate, and you know in some circles it's a huge subject, and it's dividing churches and splitting groups along different lines. We are facing a situation where we have, I would say, almost 2,000 years of Christian theology sitting on top of translations. And, you know, because for years and years the church called the shots, and oppositional voices would not be permitted. So I mean, even if there were a good linguist here and there, and they might say, well, hang on a minute, I've been looking at the manuscripts, would they be heard? I'm afraid they wouldn't, because Christian theology was already, you know, taking its course. So, and don't rock the boat, please. We've got a tradition here to defend. There's been a lot of that happening. And because I'm sometimes faced with the question from the audience, it happened just a few weeks ago, a man said to me, now, how come that for 2,000 years the church has been teaching this, and here you come from, he didn't use any disparaging term there, but like from out of nowhere, and sort of, you know, want to question that. Why should I believe you and not the church, you know, like? And then I start thinking, and I try to address it in several ways. I'm thinking myself, the church, well, who's the church? I mean, there have been many different voices in the church too over the centuries, hasn't there? But what I'm saying is, there's one reason for this, that you're hearing all this now, and not 50 years ago. 50 years ago, it would have been impossible. Certainly in Denmark and most other countries I know of, it would have been impossible. But LGBT people in those days were not spoken with or to or heard, they were talked about. Do you know what I mean? Because it was kind of maybe illegal or maybe certainly problematic to even, you know, associate with such people. And they would not have access to the media. So this is one reason why this is coming up now. For the first time in centuries of Western history, there's free speech for LGBT people. Only now can we come out of the catacombs and the closets and wherever else we've been hiding and say, hey guys, this doesn't work for me. There must be a different way of interpreting this for Christians. I can't see the Christianity even in this way of interpreting the text. It's completely off what I'm reading in the Gospel. So these concerns are now out there in the open. Maybe also that is why they're reaching to strong opposition, because people don't realize this. They think that the Christian church has always meant this, but I don't think it has. I think this has been added to it over the Middle Ages in particular. Where the church, you know, there was one church, and there was one voice about this, and there was one opinion. No debate was allowed. But theologians may have been debating among themselves, but it wouldn't trickle down to the ordinary people. So this is part of the picture we're facing here. It's going to take a long time to even keep this space open that we're talking about here. Because there's a lot of resistance on there.
In Catholic thought, particularly in modern Catholic thought, there's this idea of the development of doctrine. In other words, we have the revelation of which the scriptures bear witness to, but then our ability to receive and understand continues to grow and develop through time. And so we are, and we can demonstrate this historically, the development of our understanding of Christology, our understanding of the implications of things that were in our tradition.
Yeah.
And so there is a movement forward, and we're growing in understanding. And I think that Christians today, in the church today, we are much better informed because of the work of scholars like yourself. And we are really honored that to have such a scholar here among us. And this is really exciting for me. I love this kind of stuff. Yeah.
I wanted to say that the Holy Spirit seems to be very much at work out in the world.
Yes.
And we have new comprehension of the dynamic of homosexuality in the church that's going on. But one of the most wonderful things is that when you can go to the texts themselves and say, look, for hundreds of years these texts have been mistranslated and misinterpreted, that enhances what we're beginning to feel about what Christ would really want us to do and be among each other. And I think that's very, very, very important, and I commend you so much for the 10 years or more that you've put into this. It's just, it's awesome.
Thank you.
No, go ahead.
Now, I just think there are things we just do them because we're drawn into them. And I was drawn into there because of my pain and discomfort with the situation. I myself have managed to survive pretty well over all these years. But I know of others who I would almost say literally have gone down the drain because the weight of these texts that have been dumped on their shoulders have been too much. And quite apart from many LGBT Christians I've met personally, I remember very well my good friend Alfredo, who lives in Madrid in Spain, and one day he read my Spanish book, and then he shared with me that, yeah, I'll tell you what, when I read 1 Corinthians 6:9, and I realized that it says that homosexuals shall not inherit the kingdom of God, I was scared out of my wits, and I put the Bible aside and haven't touched it since. And she stopped going to church anymore. So if that is the effect that these mistranslations are having on people, making them leave the Christian faith and throwing them into despair and what is worse, I'm sorry folks, I feel now with trees that bear bad fruit, that Jesus and others talk about, by their fruit shall we know them. A good tree will bear good fruit and will draw people to Christ. All these misinterpretations that are driving people away from Christ, for me, stop. We have to look at this again. This cannot be right. So that all of that has sort of kept pulling me into this area of research. And when I was finally in there, I realized to my surprise that I was getting a lot of energy the other way. It wasn't just me, oh, I'm so Jewish, and oh, I'm spending all this time, oh, I'm so tired. No, I got stimulated from this whole work, so much so that when I finally got my act together, from this perspective at least, and in 2002 I signed up for a PhD. I've been reading about this for years, and I kept finding these questions. Yeah, okay, I learned this from this book, but then what about that? And then I found that in every book I was reading, and there comes a time you say, okay, well maybe it's time that I do my own research so I can find my own answers to these questions. If they can't answer them, well, go for it. So I signed up for a PhD in 2002. In January I began, and it was amazing from day one. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah had always been lurking at the back of my head, so guess what? I chose to write about that story in the Hebrew text. So what I do in my thesis is to do a literary and linguistic analysis of the Hebrew. What are these words? What do they mean? How do they resonate with other texts and so on? And it was an amazing discovery. I should add that up until this time I had suffered in my adult life from cyclical depressions, which had followed me since my teens. When I got to the month of September, having started in January, my depression sort of went and flew out of the window. So there was something waiting for me there. So having now done this work, I'm happy to report that I'm at peace with the Bible, I'm at peace with myself, and I'm at peace with God, which has been a wonderful discovery and gift, really. So I feel recompensed for all these years that I've
And now your work is helping so many others. This is what a gift. Well, St. Paul, when he was writing to Romans, says, I long to come to you to impart some spiritual gifts to you. And Renato, you have come and you've imparted a spiritual gift to us here at St. Matthew's.
Thank you.
This has been a very good experience, and I hope that you will come back again, and I hope that we can get a bigger audience to come and hear him.
And we should share with him your translation about originals.
Oh, yeah. We'll have to have that conversation
This
before you
is
go.
something, a conversation that
Yeah.
you really need to have.
Yeah.
Or he's gone back to the
Oh,
original.
yeah. I've looked at that too.
Yeah, oh, this will be good. We'll have that conversation before you go. When do you leave?
Friday.
Okay.
Friday, he goes to San Diego to present a paper. What is the?
My paper in San Diego is not on Romans 1, it's on 1 Corinthians 6, verse 9. And I'm referring back to my friend Alfredo in Madrid, because that's the verse that scared him out of his wits. So, and I've heard other people do the same, because in some translations you'll have to believe homosexuals shall not inherit the kingdom of God. And that is not what Paul is saying. So I'm discussing that verse in this paper in San Diego. I call my paper Toxic Translations.
Oh,
Toxic translations.
we gotta have a copy of it.
After it's presented, yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But
that's
a strict requirement for those events is that you
Yeah, I know
bring
you
fresh
all go
research.
on
Yeah,
papers
Yeah, I cannot
before.
show it ahead of time.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Renato.
Thank you.
It hasn't been wonderful to have him
Yes.
come and share with us. So let us stand and pray together. Loving God, we offer these intentions that we have spoken, and we offer our own personal intentions which we hold in the silence of our hearts. We ask for you to continue to extend your grace and healing light to all these that we have mentioned. And we ask for your blessing upon this community of faith that are gathered here, but especially upon our new friend and brother, Renato. He is doing your work, and we ask you to bless him, continue to bless him with an abundance of your grace. And we offer these prayers and yearnings of our hearts to you as we now pray in the words that Jesus taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. We belong to you, O Lord of our longing. We belong to you. In our daily living, dying and rising, we belong to you. We belong to you. best light up here?
Yeah. And you'll all see your smiling loves on Facebook.
Yeah, we know we're picking the tall folks, the high altitude folks.
Come on, Michael, that's you.
Okay.
Yeah, mine, yeah, mine.
May I sit?
Yeah, that's all good.
You too, yes indeed.
That'll kind of layer things. Oh, here, you could. Yeah, it could be there.
Can you grab away?
Let's see. Okay.
No, you go ahead, I'll get these.
You mind just leave it? Okay. Never mind.
Yeah, there you go.
Hey, you forward to it. I think you could trust Mandy to take a picture.
And then, yes, and let Matthew take a picture too. Then you'll.
Jen, can you come over and get in the picture?